I want to take you to some of the forests that I study and introduce you to some of the plants that comprise them. As a young boy, I visited my family's coffee estate in Karnataka in South India. Having grown up in New Delhi, plants were always in the background, ever present but passive. Suddenly placed in the middle of a tropical forest, I witnessed the plant world on a cosmopolitan scale. Massive trees towered skywards, their branches filtering out the sky above like the vaulted ceiling of a botanical cathedral. Orchids grew down from high branches, some hanging down several feet, while others had bulbs as small as a pea. Ferns grew up from soft, lush stream beds, up the trunks of trees, and filled in the cracks in giant granite boulders. Coffee bushes formed a near impenetrable undergrowth, pierced every now and then by the lance-like stems of ginger or the fluorescent leaves of cardamom. The soil was alive, crawling with millipedes, spiders, ants, frogs as tiny as a teaspoon, and bursting with seedlings rushing towards the light. Even to my uninitiated eyes, the forest had a wonderful way of making the intrigues of the plant world self-evident. I saw plants in an entirely new light, one in which they occupied center stage in a narrative rife with vibrant color, bizarre forms, and life histories that rivaled epic screenplays, murder mysteries, romance novels. Today, I want to share some of those stories with you, in the way that I encountered them, such that you may be drawn in as I was drawn in. In hindsight, I'm not surprised that my story begins in a coffee forest. Coffee is the perfect poster plant to demonstrate why plants are far from the passive landscape elements we take them to be. Long before it began being processed into espressos and cappuccinos and cold brew, the coffee plant evolved one fairly addictive biochemical compound for which it is today prized: caffeine. Over evolutionary time, caffeine has become so effective at the job that it does that it has evolved multiple times in different plant species, including tea and even chocolate. So why do coffee plants make caffeine? Well, in young plants, caffeine is mainly present in the leaves. When these die and fall to the ground, caffeine from decomposing leaves leaches into the soil, where it acts as a toxic compound, preventing other plants from germinating in the coffee plant's shade, and thereby competing with it for resources. In the intensely competitive environment of a tropical forest, coffee uses caffeine to establish a monopoly on soil itself. So, the first role of caffeine is as weed killer, quite literally to weed out the competition. As the coffee plant flowers, its nectar too is laced with caffeine. As pollinators arrive and the bees get buzzed on coffee nectar, it aids neurological pathways which affect memory, decrease confusion, and make bees more likely to remember the fragrance of coffee flowers. This makes them more likely to visit neighboring coffee plants and successfully pollinate them. So the second role of caffeine is to manipulate bee brain chemistry, and incidentally that of ours, when we consume coffee. Finally, when the coffee plant fruits, caffeine in its seeds acts as an insecticide, the bitter chemicals preventing damage from beetles and other seed-eating insects to ensure that the coffee plant lives on. A powerful agent of plant communication, caffeine interacts with and speaks to multiple players in the ecosystem, engineering the environment to make it perfect for the coffee plant. The coffee plant's cunning manipulation of its environment and the species it tactfully evades and befriends opened up a whole new dimension of the plant world for me. Far from inanimate, these were dynamic and devious organisms using every evolutionary trick in the book to survive in an intensely competitive environment. And they seemed to be winning. I was hooked. However, plants can manipulate far more than just their external environment. Some go so far as to manipulate the genes of their neighbors. Let me introduce you to one of the plant world's most nefarious parasites, the dodder. With no leaves, no roots, and no chlorophyll, one can say that it's got a fairly raw evolutionary deal. Growing as a mass of endlessly tangled and intertwined tendrils enmeshed in the branches of a tree, its translucent stems are strikingly reminiscent of a generous helping of noodles. I don't know about you, but that was nearly edible to me. It's often found growing on trees and shrubs around campus. Upon sprouting, dodder seedlings have 5 days to find a host plant, or they will die. These seedlings spare no time in springing into ill-natured action, and no sooner have they germinated that they begin to sense and grow towards specific chemicals emitted by their host plants. The doddered seedlings can smell their hosts without a nose and can even distinguish between specific chemicals emitted by different species, only extending their tendrils in the direction of those species they are accustomed to parasitizing. When they make contact, tissues fuse, and then the real crime begins. A recent study has found that much of the dodder's genome originates in its host plants. Over evolutionary time, dodders have evolved to pull off a physiologically complex DNA heist from their neighbors, incorporating genes from neighboring plants into their own genome to use them to more efficiently find and parasitize their hosts. This genetic theft is unprecedented from complex organisms, and its mechanisms are still largely a mystery. The dodder can even use its stolen tools to switch off certain genes in its hosts, specifically those linked to defense. A feat not accomplished by modern science till the 1990s. So, it would seem, plants are capable of far more than animals can even dream of, and importantly, they can sense and learn. In fact, some plants can even talk, and forests can sometimes get quite noisy with plant chatter. It's just that plant conversations take place through senses we don't ordinarily possess. Usually, chemical signals in mass communications for aeons, and their Instagram stories come in the form of clouds of biochemicals emitted into the forest air. A good example of a chatty tree is the alder, many species of which grow in my research site in the western Himalayas. When an alder tree is under attack, it emits specific chemical signals as a distress signal that can be sensed by its neighbors. Upon receiving this alder alert, neighboring alders can ramp up the production of toxins in their own leaves and can even switch on certain self-defense genes to better prepare themselves for an impending attack. Some species take this a step further, emitting signals that summon predators of their own predators, summoning their own army, so to speak. If biochemicals are the alder tree's social media, the forest mycelial network is its World Wide Web. This is a vast underground matrix of plant roots and fungal threads that intertwine to form an incredibly efficient communication system. Apart from receiving and sending distress signals, trees can use the mycelial network to nurse their sick, feed their young, and share resources in times of hardship. In studies monitoring the network after forest fires, older trees were observed sharing sugars and nutrients with younger ones. Similarly, mother plants have been observed selectively nursing their own seedlings, thereby giving them an advantage above other species. So, no plant is an island. Like us, they can use both wired and wireless forms of communication to talk and to listen, to form communities that bridge the gaps between species and even kingdoms, and to protect these communities against hardships. However, plant intelligence, communication, and drama reaches Shakespearean levels when it comes to reproduction. As we have acknowledged, plants are rooted to the spot. While they have ways to interact and communicate, they can't get together to create more plants. So, since their inception, plants have relied on intermediaries. the most successful of which have been the insects. However, insect assistance comes with a price. Plants typically produce pollen and nectar as rewards, while collecting which, insects usually inadvertently pollinate flowers. Some plants, however, have evolved to dupe their cooperators in this age-old give and take. Enter the bee orchid. Dangling on a singular long stem growing from a plant anchored to a tree trunk, its movements in the breeze mimic the lazy flight of a bee. A modified fifth petal has even evolved to be bee-shaped, complete with a glossy body to mimic the wings and a fuzzy underside to complete the disguise. I mean, look at that. That's uncanny. Can you see the bee? Anyway. Some species take this a step further by producing specific chemicals which mimic the sex pheromones of female bees. No sooner has this tiny orchid bloomed that it is surrounded by a cloud of sex-seeking male bees, all hoping to get with the new girl. In their frantic efforts to mount their deceptive date, they unwittingly pollinate the orchid, but eventually leave disappointed. The orchid has achieved its ends without wasting any expensive energy on precious rewards. This calculating shrewdness is a classical feature of plant evolution, but plant love can get oh so much messier. One of the more famous love triangles from the forest is that between the ants, the wasps, and their common mistress, the fig tree. First, the terms of the relationships. The ants protect the tree from herbivores and disperse its seeds, in return for a sugary syrup secreted by the tree from specialized nectaries. The wasps pollinate the tree's figs, which contain its flowers, and in return get to lay their eggs inside the figs, and thereby get the advantage of a hidden nursery. Each partner tries to get away with something behind the tree's back. The wasps occasionally parasitize the figs, whereas the ants farm another species of insect on the fig sap for food. Figs have responded to their partners' infidelities in a variety of ways. Some have dried up their nectaries altogether, cutting the ants out of the relationship. Others have played the ants against the wasps, continuing to feed them with the realization that ants occasionally prey on parasitic wasps and thereby eventually benefit the tree. Most species, however, have learned to balance this relationship, evolving techniques of their own like toxic sap and synchronized fruiting to ensure that despite their partner's transgressions, none can get away with manipulating their mistress. Such deception and double dealing is common in the plant world, all part of the delicate balance to skew the relationships in the ecosystem to the plant's benefit. Unlike the silent background we take them to be, plants have been communicating, competing, and cooperating with organisms in their surroundings for millennia. Like animals, and in fact, like humans, they can love, deceive, bribe, trap, poison, and pilfer. They are the overlooked protagonists of a secret drama playing out all around us. In more ways than one, we ourselves are embroiled in this drama ever since the time we started evolving alongside them. The forms, fragrances, and fruits that plants have developed to attract the eyes of pollinators and dispersers have also been incredibly successful at attracting the attention of our own highly intelligent ape eyes. Orchids radiated into thousands of forms to attract pollinators, and in our love for these forms, we have pollinated orchids with a mania that has resulted in still thousands more varieties, arguably to the orchid's mutual benefit. We have taken a handful of plants to every continent on the globe. Knowingly or unknowingly, we have done a better job of propagating and dispersing crop plants than any other animal disperser ever could. plants have permeated every sphere of our lives, from the more visible, food, fiber, and medicine, to the more intangible, cultural symbolism, linguistic motifs, and even our aesthetic sensibilities. In many ways, we share the stage in this botanical drama. We are all part of the theatre of the forest. Recognizing the ways in which plants communicate, not just in specific instances, but learning to decode their language, can make available to us new ways of knowing and being. Instead of viewing the human and plant worlds as apart, they can begin to converge, and we can begin to receive and reciprocate stimuli from sources we earlier considered inanimate. Yet despite being the extraordinary characters which weave the diverse stories we witness today, as of 2020, 40% of all plant species are estimated to be threatened with extinction. Many of these species are yet undiscovered by science, still waiting in the wings, their stories yet untold. In fact, the loss of these species can be likened to the loss of an entire section from the library of life before we have even made it past the preface of the first book. But these plants don't just represent stories. They represent vital genes, potentially life-saving drugs, millions of years of evolution, but perhaps most importantly, an entire interwoven web of relationships with other living beings, including ourselves. The loss of these interrelationships threatens to unravel that forest we began with, because it is sustained by millions of organisms interacting with each other in each moment. Life sustains life. To be able to effectively conserve these relationships, we must understand them and understand the players which comprise them. I believe that the rediscovery of this world of plants, with all its brilliant and bizarre characters, as a world not apart from our own, is vital for its future survival. When the imagined divide between our world and theirs dissolves, conservation becomes self-preservation. And if there is anything to take away from the stories I've just told you, it is that we can find endless ways, beautiful in form and efficient in function, to give ourselves the best chance at survival. Thank you.